400,000 German prisoners of war arrived in the United States between 1942 and 1946. They came in waves, captured from battlefields across North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany itself. The United States military established over 500 camps to house them, scattered across nearly every state in the Union. In these camps, something unexpected happened that would reshape the lives of thousands of men and influence the rebuilding of post-war Germany. The American military authorities made a decision that seemed radical at the time. They would not simply warehouse these prisoners for the duration of the war. They would attempt to re-educate them, to expose them to democratic principles, to give them books and knowledge that had been banned or suppressed under the Nazi regime. This program, which came to be known informally as the Re-Education Initiative, represented one of the most ambitious attempts at ideological transformation ever undertaken. The prisoners who arrived in America came from vastly different backgrounds. Some were committed Nazis who volunteered for military service with enthusiasm. Others were conscripts who had little choice in the matter. Some were teenagers who had known nothing but Hitler's Germany their entire conscious lives. Others were older men who remembered the Weimar Republic and had watched with varying degrees of horror or acceptance as democracy gave way to dictatorship. Many were simply soldiers who had done what soldiers do, following orders without much thought to the larger political implications. When these men first arrived at American camps, they brought with them the conditioning of years under Nazi rule. Hardcore Nazis among the prisoner population initially dominated camp life in many locations. They enforced discipline, punished those they considered traitors or weaklings, and maintained the rigid hierarchy of the Third Reich even behind barbed wire. Prisoners who expressed doubts about Nazi ideology or who seemed too friendly with American guards risked beatings or worse from their fellow captives. The Americans recognized this problem early. Military intelligence officers interviewed prisoners and began to separate the committed Nazis from those who seemed more amenable to democratic ideas. They created separate compounds for the hardcore Nazis and began focusing their educational efforts on prisoners who showed potential for change. This wasn't a simple or perfect process. Determining who was truly a committed Nazi and who was simply going along to survive was difficult. Some prisoners learned to say what the Americans wanted to hear. Others genuinely began to question beliefs they had held for years. The educational program started modestly. Camp libraries were established, stocked with books in German. These weren't propaganda texts but rather classics of German literature, works of philosophy, history, and science. Prisoners could read Goethe and Schiller, Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse. They could access books that had been burned by the Nazis or suppressed as degenerate or subversive. For many prisoners, particularly younger ones who had never known anything but Nazi censorship, this was a revelation. Ideas and perspectives they had never encountered suddenly became available. American authorities brought in German-speaking educators, many of them refugees from Nazi Germany themselves. These instructors held classes on history, politics, economics, and civics. They didn't simply tell the prisoners that Nazism was evil and democracy was good. Instead, they encouraged critical thinking, debate, and independent analysis. They exposed prisoners to primary sources, to different interpretations of historical events, to the principles underlying democratic governance. The goal wasn't to turn Germans into Americans but to help them understand alternatives to totalitarianism. Many prisoners initially resisted. They had been taught that Americans were weak, decadent, controlled by Jews and international financiers. They expected prison camps to be brutal places where they would be mistreated and starved. Instead, they found themselves relatively well-fed, housed in weatherproofed barracks, allowed to organize their own camp activities, and given access to education. This cognitive dissonance created an opening. If what they had been told about Americans was wrong, what else might be false? The camps established newspapers written and edited by prisoners under American supervision. These newspapers carried news from the war, yes, but also articles about American life, translations of American editorials, and pieces written by prisoners themselves grappling with political and philosophical questions. Prisoners organized theatrical productions, musical performances, and art classes. They created camp universities where prisoners with expertise in various subjects taught their fellow captives. A prisoner who had been a professor of mathematics before the war might teach calculus. A former engineer might give lectures on technical subjects. Sports played an important role as well. The camps organized soccer leagues, and the competition was fierce. Americans understood that physical activity and organized recreation helped maintain morale and discipline. But sports also taught lessons about fair play, rules, and competition within agreed-upon boundaries, concepts that had been perverted by Nazi ideology into notions of racial struggle and survival of the fittest. Religious services were permitted for prisoners who wanted to attend. Chaplains, both American and German-speaking, held services and counseled prisoners. For some men, particularly those who had seen terrible things during the war, these religious discussions provided a framework for moral reflection and grappling with guilt. Not every prisoner was religious, of course, but for those who were, the church services became important spaces for contemplation. The work the prisoners did also became part of their education in a way. They worked on farms, in forests, in food processing plants. They saw American communities up close. Small-town Americans would see these prisoners working in nearby fields. Sometimes interactions were hostile. American families who had lost sons in the war weren't always happy to see German soldiers, even captured ones, living relatively comfortably. But other interactions were more nuanced. A farmer whose German-American grandfather had immigrated decades earlier might strike up conversations. Prisoners might be invited to a family dinner. These personal connections humanized both sides. One of the most effective tools in the re-education process turned out to be simply exposing prisoners to American prosperity and freedom. Prisoners could see that American workers lived well, that farms were productive, that people seemed generally content. They could observe elections happening, even if they couldn't participate. They could see newspapers freely criticizing the government without journalists being arrested. For prisoners who had been told that democracy was chaos and weakness, the reality of a functioning democratic society was educational in itself. The program wasn't universally successful. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis throughout their captivity and beyond. They saw the educational efforts as propaganda and dismissed everything they were told. Some went through the motions of conversion to gain privileges but retained their core beliefs. The hardcore Nazis who were separated into special camps actively resisted any re-education efforts and worked to maintain Nazi discipline and ideology among themselves. But many prisoners did change. The transformation wasn't always dramatic or complete, but seeds were planted. A prisoner might read a banned book and find his worldview shifting slightly. Another might attend a lecture on democratic theory and begin questioning whether the Führer principle really made sense. A third might have a conversation with an American guard or civilian that challenged his stereotypes. These small shifts accumulated over months and years of captivity. As the war progressed and particularly after it ended, prisoners received more information about what had been happening in Germany. When news of the concentration camps and the Holocaust began to reach prisoner compounds, reactions varied enormously. Some prisoners refused to believe it, dismissing it as Allied propaganda. Others were genuinely shocked and horrified. Many claimed they had no idea that regular Wehrmacht soldiers knew nothing of the death camps. This was partly true and partly self-serving. The line between willful ignorance and genuine innocence was often blurry. American authorities made a controversial decision to show prisoners documentary footage of the liberated concentration camps. They wanted to confront the prisoners with the reality of what had been done in Germany's name. The screenings were mandatory in many camps. Prisoners watched in silence as the footage revealed the piles of corpses, the emaciated survivors, the industrial machinery of genocide. Some prisoners wept. Others sat stone-faced. Still others insisted it was fabricated or exaggerated. But the footage was impossible to completely dismiss. It forced a reckoning, even for those who tried to look away. The re-education program intensified after Germany's surrender. With the war over, the focus shifted explicitly toward preparing prisoners to return home and participate in building a new, democratic Germany. Special schools were established in some camps where prisoners could receive more intensive instruction. They studied the Weimar Constitution, American and British political systems, economic theory, and the history of democratic movements. They learned about the mistakes that had led to Weimar's collapse and how democracy might be made more resilient. Prisoners began to be repatriated in stages starting in 1946. The process took time because Europe was in chaos and shipping was limited. Priority generally went to prisoners who had shown the most promise in the re-education program, the theory being that these men could become positive influences in post-war Germany. As prisoners prepared to leave, American officials gave them certificates, documents, and sometimes letters of recommendation. Some prisoners were recruited to work in various capacities for the American occupation authorities in Germany. When these former prisoners returned home, they found a country utterly destroyed. German cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. The economy had collapsed. Food was scarce. The psychological trauma was immense. Germany was occupied and divided among the victorious powers. In this context, the education and experiences these men had gained in American prison camps took on new significance. Some former prisoners of war became teachers in the new German educational system, bringing with them the pedagogical approaches they had experienced in the camps. Others went into politics, particularly local politics where they could apply democratic principles they had learned. Still others became journalists, businessmen, or civil servants. They weren't always vocal about their time as prisoners in America. In some contexts, it could be a source of shame or suspicion. But quietly, many of them worked to build the democratic institutions of the new West Germany. The impact is difficult to quantify precisely. How do you measure the influence of 400,000 men who had been exposed to democratic ideas and practices? Not all of them became active democratizers. Many just wanted to rebuild their lives, find their families, and try to forget the war. But collectively, this group represented a significant cadre of Germans who had direct experience with democratic governance and American society at a time when Germany was being rebuilt from scratch. Some prisoners never returned to Germany at all. They chose to stay in America. This was not initially easy. Immigration laws and public sentiment in the immediate post-war period were not favorable to former enemy soldiers settling permanently. But over time, pathways opened up. Some prisoners had married American women, relationships that began through correspondence or brief encounters during their captivity. Others sponsored relatives from Germany and established themselves as Americans. By the 1950s and 60s, thousands of former German prisoners of war had become American citizens. These men brought with them complex identities. They had fought for Nazi Germany, many of them willingly. They had been captured and imprisoned. They had been educated and influenced by American democratic ideals. They had witnessed their homeland's destruction and moral catastrophe. And then they had chosen to make America their home. Processing all of this required tremendous psychological flexibility and often involved burying or reframing parts of their past. The children and grandchildren of these former prisoners sometimes knew little about their fathers' or grandfathers' wartime experiences. The stories were too complicated, too painful, too morally ambiguous. It was easier to say that grandfather came to America after the war without going into the details of how or why. But the experiences shaped these men in ways that influenced how they raised their children, what values they emphasized, how they thought about politics and society. The American military learned valuable lessons from the prisoner of war education program as well. During the Korean War and later conflicts, similar approaches were attempted with varying degrees of success. The idea that prisoners could be re-educated, that ideology was not fixed but could be changed through exposure to alternative ideas and humane treatment, became part of American military doctrine. This sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, depending on the context and the commitment of the individuals involved. Looking back at this program from our current perspective, it's easy to see both its achievements and its limitations. On one hand, it represented a genuinely humane approach to dealing with captured enemies. Rather than seeking revenge or simply warehousing prisoners, American authorities tried to use the period of captivity productively. They exposed men to ideas and experiences that many found genuinely transformative. They treated prisoners according to international law and often better than required. They invested resources in education when they could have simply focused on containment. On the other hand, the program had significant flaws and blind spots. It couldn't reach everyone. The most committed Nazis were generally unreachable, and the program may have actually hardened some men in their beliefs. The separation of prisoners into categories based on their political reliability was imperfect and sometimes arbitrary. The program also had a strong element of propaganda, even if more sophisticated than simple sloganeering. American authorities had strategic goals in re-educating German prisoners, not purely humanitarian motives. They wanted to shape post-war Germany in ways favorable to American interests. The racial contradictions were particularly stark. Here were American authorities teaching German prisoners about democracy and equality while black American soldiers faced segregation and discrimination. Some German prisoners noted this hypocrisy. They observed that they, as white enemy prisoners, were sometimes treated better than black American citizens. This complicated the moral lessons the Americans were trying to teach. It suggested that American democracy was aspirational rather than fully realized, an important lesson but not the one American authorities necessarily intended. The experiences of individual prisoners varied enormously based on where they were held, who was in charge of their particular camp, and their own personal characteristics. A prisoner held in a camp in Texas with a commander who believed strongly in re-education had a very different experience from one held in a remote camp in the Northwest where educational resources were limited. A prisoner who spoke some English and was naturally curious had different opportunities than one who was illiterate and traumatized. Some of the most interesting stories come from prisoners who formed lasting relationships with Americans during their captivity. There are accounts of prisoners who were housed on farms where they worked closely with farming families. Over months of daily interaction, initial hostility or wariness gave way to mutual respect and sometimes even affection. After the war, some of these relationships continued through correspondence. A few prisoners were sponsored by their former employers to return to America permanently. The camp newspapers provide a fascinating window into prisoner thinking during this period. Articles in these newspapers show men grappling with profound questions. What had gone wrong in Germany? How had they been deceived? What responsibility did ordinary Germans bear for the crimes of the Nazi regime? What kind of Germany should emerge from the ruins? These were not abstract academic debates but urgent personal questions. The answers these men arrived at would shape their actions when they returned home. Educational theater was particularly effective in some camps. Prisoners staged plays that dealt with political and moral themes. They performed works by playwrights who had been banned under the Nazis. They also wrote and performed original works that processed their experiences. Theater provided a way to explore difficult ideas through character and story rather than direct argument. A prisoner who might resist a lecture on democracy might be moved by a play that showed the human consequences of totalitarianism. Music played a similar role. German musical traditions were strong, and many prisoners were accomplished musicians. Camp orchestras and choirs formed. They performed classical works but also more contemporary pieces. Music provided continuity with their culture while also creating space for reflection. Singing Beethoven's Ode to Joy with its themes of human brotherhood took on new meaning for men who had been taught to view other peoples as inferior. The practical skills training that some prisoners received also had long-term impacts. Prisoners could take courses in trades like carpentry, mechanics, or agriculture. When they returned to Germany, these skills were valuable in the reconstruction effort. A prisoner who had learned modern American farming techniques could apply those methods back home. One who had studied small engine repair had marketable skills. This practical education complemented the political and philosophical education. Letters between prisoners and their families in Germany reveal the gradual shifts in thinking that occurred. Early letters often contained standard nationalist sentiments, constrained both by genuine belief and by censorship. Later letters sometimes showed more questioning attitudes. A prisoner might write about reading a particular book or having a particular conversation that made him think differently about things. Families back home, struggling with the daily realities of war and then defeat, sometimes found these letters from America strange or unsettling. 400,000 German prisoners of war arrived in the United States between 1942 and 1946. They came in waves, captured from battlefields across North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany itself. The United States military established over 500 camps to house them, scattered across nearly every state in the Union. The prisoner of war experience intersected in interesting ways with the broader German-American community in the United States. German immigration to America had been substantial in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Many Americans had German ancestry. The World Wars had created complicated feelings within this community. During World War II, German Americans often went to great lengths to demonstrate their American loyalty. Having German prisoners of war in their communities brought these tensions to the surface. Some German-American families sought to help prisoners, seeing in them echoes of relatives in Germany or feeling a cultural connection. They might volunteer to teach classes at camps or donate books. Others wanted nothing to do with the prisoners, seeing them as representatives of the regime that had devastated their ancestral homeland. Still others had more mercenary interests, seeing opportunities for business or labor. These interactions between prisoners and German Americans created bridges between the old country and the new. The question of guilt and responsibility was central to the re-education program. American educators tried to make prisoners understand the crimes committed by the Nazi regime and Germany's responsibility for the war. But they also tried to distinguish between collective historical responsibility and individual guilt. Not every German soldier was personally guilty of war crimes, but all Germans bore some responsibility for what had been done in their name. This was a subtle distinction, and many prisoners struggled with it. Some prisoners engaged in what we might now call moral injury. They had fought for a cause they believed was righteous only to discover it was profoundly evil. They had risked their lives, lost comrades, and caused death and suffering for a regime that was morally bankrupt. Processing this required confronting painful truths about themselves and their choices. The education program provided some tools for this processing, but ultimately each man had to find his own way through this moral wilderness. The camp churches became important spaces for this moral reckoning. Chaplains heard confessions and counseled troubled men. Religious frameworks provided language and concepts for discussing guilt, repentance, and redemption that secular education could not. For some prisoners, religious conversion or reconversion was part of their transformation. They came to see their wartime experiences through a theological lens that helped them make sense of suffering and evil. Not all prisoners were German, of course. Some were Austrians who had been incorporated into the Greater German Reich. Others were ethnic Germans from various parts of Eastern Europe. Each group had somewhat different relationships to Nazi ideology and different prospects for the post-war period. The education program tried to account for these differences but often lumped everyone together as Germans. The program also had to deal with the reality that some prisoners were essentially children. 17- and 18-year-old soldiers captured late in the war had barely any adult experience outside of Nazi indoctrination. Re-educating them was both easier in some ways because their beliefs were less fixed and harder in others because they had less life experience to draw on in evaluating new ideas. These young prisoners were particularly targeted for intensive education because they would have the longest time to influence post-war Germany. As the Cold War began to emerge even before World War II officially ended, the goalposts of the re-education program shifted somewhat. Initially, the aim was simply to denazify German prisoners and introduce them to democratic principles. But as tensions with the Soviet Union increased, American authorities became more focused on making sure these Germans would be oriented toward the West rather than toward communism. Anti-communist education was added to the curriculum. Prisoners learned about the dangers of totalitarianism in both its fascist and communist forms. This Cold War context also affected which prisoners were repatriated first and how. Prisoners who seemed likely to be pro-Western in their orientation were prioritized for return to the American, British, and French zones of occupation. There were concerns about sending prisoners back to areas that would become East Germany where they might be subject to Soviet influence or punishment for having been captured by the West. Some prisoners from what would become East Germany chose not to return at all, fearing persecution under communist rule. The bureaucratic machinery required to run this education program was substantial. The military had to hire or recruit German-speaking educators, develop curricula, acquire books and materials, establish evaluation systems, and track outcomes. Special divisions within the military were created to oversee prisoner re-education. Intellectuals and academics were brought in as consultants. The whole enterprise required coordination between military authorities, intelligence services, and civilian experts. Evaluating the success of the program was difficult. How do you measure whether someone has genuinely changed their political beliefs or is simply giving the appearance of change? The military developed various testing and interview protocols, but these could be gamed. Some prisoners became adept at telling Americans what they wanted to hear while privately maintaining their old beliefs. Others genuinely changed but were poor at articulating their transformation in ways that satisfied evaluators. The assessment process was imperfect at best. The legacy of this program influenced how the United States approached occupation and reconstruction in Germany after the war. The successful re-education of prisoners provided a template for broader denazification and re-education efforts in occupied Germany. Many of the same people who had worked on prisoner education continued that work in occupied Germany itself. The lessons learned, both positive and negative, shaped Allied occupation policy. Former prisoners who became American citizens brought unique perspectives to American society. They understood European politics in visceral ways. They could speak to the dangers of totalitarianism from personal experience. They often became fierce anti-communists, having seen one form of totalitarianism up close and wanting to prevent another. Some became politically active, particularly in foreign policy debates concerning Germany and Europe. They served as bridges between American and German society during the crucial post-war decades. The generational effects were significant as well. The children of former prisoners who stayed in America grew up in households where German was spoken but where American identity was strongly emphasized. They were raised with stories about the war and its aftermath that shaped their understanding of history and politics. Some became scholars or teachers themselves, bringing their family histories into academic or educational contexts. Others simply carried forward the values their fathers had absorbed during their time as prisoners of war and passed those values to their own children. There were also prisoners who returned to Germany, worked to rebuild their country, and then later immigrated to America through normal channels. They had seen America as prisoners, liked what they saw, and wanted to return as free men. They established businesses, joined professions, and became part of the fabric of American immigrant communities. Their path to American citizenship wound through the strange detour of having first been enemy prisoners of war. The psychological complexity of these experiences cannot be overstated. Imagine being a German soldier, perhaps believing in your cause, fighting for your country. You are captured and expect harsh treatment. Instead, you find relative comfort and people trying to educate you about democracy. You begin to question beliefs you held dear. You learn that your country has committed unspeakable crimes. The war ends and your homeland is destroyed. You return to chaos and ruin, trying to rebuild. Or perhaps you choose to stay in the country that captured you, making a new life there. Each of these transitions required enormous psychological adjustment. Some prisoners struggled with post-traumatic stress, though that term didn't exist in the same way then. They had experienced combat, loss, captivity, and profound ideological upheaval. They had witnessed or participated in things they would rather forget. They had to construct new identities from the wreckage of old certainties. Not all of them managed this successfully. Some became bitter. Others withdrew. But many did find ways to build productive lives, channeling their experiences into constructive purposes. The American guards and administrators who ran the camps also had complex experiences. They were charged with holding enemy prisoners but also with treating them humanely and trying to change their minds. Many guards were German Americans themselves, adding another layer of complication. They had to maintain security while also creating an environment conducive to education and reflection. Some administrators took the re-education mission very seriously and invested tremendous energy in trying to reach prisoners. Others viewed it more skeptically as either a waste of time or propaganda that made them uncomfortable. Relationships between guards and prisoners sometimes became surprisingly cordial. This troubled some people who felt that fraternization with the enemy was inappropriate. But it was also inevitable given years of daily interaction. Guards and prisoners were all young men far from home. They shared cigarettes, conversations, and sometimes even common interests. These human connections were both a complication for military discipline and a powerful tool for the re-education program, showing prisoners that Americans were not the monsters they had been told to expect. The economic dimension of the prisoner of war experience also mattered. Prisoners worked and were paid modest amounts for their labor. They could buy small luxuries from camp canteens. This taste of consumer culture and market economics was eye-opening for some. The ability to choose what to purchase with earned money, even in the limited context of a prison camp, demonstrated aspects of economic freedom that complemented the political education they were receiving. American agricultural communities that hosted prisoner workers had mixed feelings about the arrangement. On one hand, the labor was desperately needed because so many American men were overseas. On the other hand, it felt strange and sometimes offensive to have enemy soldiers working American fields. Over time, as prisoners proved themselves to be hard workers and as personal relationships developed, attitudes often softened. Some farmers advocated for their prisoner workers, arguing that these particular men were good people who had just been on the wrong side. The media paid attention to the prisoner of war program, though coverage was mixed. Some newspapers and magazines ran sympathetic stories about re-education efforts, presenting them as examples of American values in action. Others were more critical, questioning whether enemies deserved such treatment when American prisoners of war in Japanese camps were suffering terribly. The contrast between how America treated captured Germans and how Japan treated captured Americans was stark and raised legitimate moral questions about reciprocity and revenge. Popular culture also engaged with the presence of German prisoners of war in America. There were news reels, magazine articles, and eventually books and films that dealt with the subject. These representations shaped public understanding and attitudes. They ranged from sympathetic portrayals of prisoners as young men caught up in forces beyond their control to more negative depictions of unreconstructed Nazis who remained dangerous even in captivity. As the years passed and the wartime generation aged, oral history projects began capturing the stories of former prisoners. These interviews revealed the tremendous diversity of experiences and attitudes. Some former prisoners spoke with gratitude about their treatment in America and credited their time there with transforming their lives. Others remained bitter about the defeat and the destruction of Germany, viewing their captivity as simply a period to be endured. Still others had more ambivalent feelings, acknowledging positive aspects of the experience while also feeling that they had been subjected to propaganda. The archives contain thousands of documents related to the prisoner of war program, administrative records, educational materials, prisoner newspapers, intelligence reports, photographs, and more. These materials provide rich resources for historians trying to understand both the program itself and the broader questions it raises about the malleability of political beliefs, the ethics of re-education, and the possibilities for reconciliation after war. Contemporary scholars have debated how much credit the prisoner of war education program deserves for the success of post-war German democracy. Clearly, many factors contributed to West Germany's democratic transformation, including the Marshall Plan, the occupation policies of the Western Allies, the revulsion against Nazism after the Holocaust was fully revealed, and the threat from Soviet communism that made Western orientation attractive. The re-education of prisoners of war was one element among many. But for the individual men who went through the program, it was often decisive in shaping their personal trajectories. The ethical questions raised by the program remain relevant. Is it appropriate to try to change prisoners' political beliefs? Where is the line between education and indoctrination? The Americans believed they were teaching truth and democratic values. But the prisoners were in a coercive situation, unable to leave, dependent on their captors. Can genuine ideological transformation occur under such conditions, or is it always tainted by the power imbalance? These questions don't have easy answers. At the same time, doing nothing would have had its own ethical implications. Simply holding prisoners without any attempt at education or moral reckoning would have meant returning hundreds of thousands of men to Germany with their Nazi indoctrination intact. Given that Germany would need to be rebuilt and democratized, having a cadre of men who understood democratic principles and had positive experiences with democracy seemed valuable. The question was how to pursue this goal ethically and effectively. The program also raises questions about national identity and belonging. What does it mean that former enemy soldiers became American citizens? Does it matter that they once fought against America? Should there be a path to redemption and new belonging, or are some actions disqualifying? American society answered these questions pragmatically, allowing former prisoners to immigrate and naturalize if they met certain criteria. But the underlying moral questions remained. For the men who made this journey from German soldier to American citizen, the sense of dislocation must have been profound. They had to learn a new language or improve the English they had started learning in camp. They had to understand American customs and culture beyond what they had seen as prisoners. They had to find work, establish homes, and build lives in a society that had recently been their enemy. And they had to do all of this while carrying memories and experiences that few Americans could fully understand. Some of these former prisoners became advocates for German-American friendship and cultural exchange. They worked to build bridges between their old homeland and their new one. They explained Germany to Americans and America to Germans. They served as living examples that former enemies could become friends and fellow citizens. In the context of the Cold War, when West Germany and the United States were allies against the Soviet Union, this role took on strategic importance as well. The women who married former German prisoners of war had their own complex experiences. American women who fell in love with enemy soldiers faced social stigma and family opposition. Their relationships challenged wartime propaganda about the Germans as monsters. These couples had to navigate not just the normal challenges of marriage but also the added burdens of cultural difference, language barriers, and social disapproval. Yet many of these marriages succeeded, producing children who were both German and American in heritage. Educational institutions in post-war Germany bore the imprint of men who had been educated in American prison camps. They brought with them pedagogical approaches that emphasized critical thinking, discussion, and independent analysis rather than rote memorization and obedience to authority. They pushed back against attempts to simply replace Nazi indoctrination with different indoctrination. They argued for education that would help students think for themselves. This approach became part of the foundation for German democratic education. The business sector also saw influence from former prisoners. Men who had observed American business practices and economic systems brought those insights back to Germany. They understood markets, entrepreneurship, and labor relations in ways shaped by their American experiences. As West Germany experienced its economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s, some of this American influence was visible in how businesses were structured and operated. Local politics in post-war Germany provided opportunities for former prisoners to apply what they had learned. Town councils, local administrative posts, and community organizations became venues where democratic practices could be implemented at a grassroots level. National politics might be dominated by older figures from the Weimar era, but at the local level, younger men including returned prisoners of war could make their mark. The Catholic and Protestant churches in Germany also felt the impact of returned prisoners who had experienced religious ministry in American camps. They had encountered different models of church-state relations and religious pluralism. They had discussed theology with American chaplains and German religious intellectuals in exile. These experiences influenced how they thought about the role of churches in a democratic society. Trade unions in Germany became another venue where former prisoners applied lessons learned. American unions had been different from German ones under both Weimar and the Nazis. Prisoners who had observed or learned about American labor relations brought ideas about collective bargaining, worker rights, and labor management cooperation. These ideas fed into the development of West German labor relations. The impact on families was significant. Men who had been transformed by their prisoner of war experiences returned to wives and children who had their own traumatic experiences of war and defeat. Sometimes the returning prisoners' new democratic beliefs clashed with family members who remained more traditional or nationalist in their views. Navigating these family dynamics required patience and often compromise. But it also meant that democratic ideas spread through family networks. Youth organizations in post-war Germany were influenced by former prisoners who had experienced American approaches to youth development. Boy Scouts, sports clubs, and educational programs borrowed from American models. The emphasis on leadership development, democratic decision-making, and individual initiative reflected lessons learned in American camps. The complicated process of denazification in post-war Germany involved former prisoners in various ways. Some served as witnesses in trials or investigations. Others worked in administrative capacities helping to vet Germans for positions in the new government. Their experiences gave them perspectives on who might be genuinely reformed versus who was simply opportunistic. But they also faced accusations themselves, having to explain their own wartime activities and demonstrate their transformation. Monuments and memorials in post-war Germany had to reckon with how to remember the war. Former prisoners often advocated for memorials that acknowledged German suffering while also recognizing German responsibility for the war and the Holocaust. This balance was difficult to strike. How do you mourn your dead without glorifying the cause for which they fought? How do you accept responsibility without becoming paralyzed by guilt? These questions animated debates about memory in which returned prisoners of war participated. The question of reparations to victims of Nazi Germany also involved returned prisoners in various ways. As West Germany began making reparations payments and providing restitution to survivors of the Holocaust and other victims, debates emerged about the extent and nature of these obligations. Some former prisoners, having learned about the full extent of Nazi crimes during their captivity, strongly supported reparations. Others were more reluctant, seeing them as acknowledging a collective guilt that they did not feel personally. Educational exchange programs between Germany and the United States built on foundations partly laid by the prisoner of war experience. Returned prisoners who had positive experiences in America advocated for exchanges that would allow Germans to study in the United States and Americans to study in Germany. These programs helped cement the alliance between the two countries and spread American influence in Germany. The psychological literature on attitude change and persuasion drew on studies of the prisoner of war re-education program. Social psychologists were interested in understanding what made some men change their beliefs while others remained resistant. The research findings suggested that personal relationships, cognitive dissonance, gradual exposure to new ideas, and positive reinforcement were more effective than confrontation or punishment. These insights influence later approaches to everything from advertising to public health campaigns. Military doctrine on handling prisoners of war incorporated lessons from the German prisoner experience. The idea that prisoners should be treated humanely not just for moral reasons but for strategic ones, the recognition that well-treated prisoners provide better intelligence, and the possibility of turning former enemies into allies through education all became part of how the American military thought about captives. The Cold War presented ironic situations where former German soldiers who had fought against America now stood alongside America against the Soviet Union. Some former prisoners even joined or worked with NATO forces. The enemy of yesterday became the ally of today. This realignment required psychological gymnastics but was facilitated by the education and experiences these men had gained during their captivity. Art created by prisoners during their captivity provides fascinating insights into their experiences and transformations. Paintings, drawings, and sculptures produced in camp art classes reveal how prisoners processed their situations. Some art was nostalgic, depicting German landscapes and scenes from home. Other art grappled with more difficult themes of war, guilt, and change. Museums have collected and displayed this prisoner art as historical evidence of this unusual chapter. Music composed by prisoners also tells stories. Some prisoners were accomplished composers who continued their work in captivity. They wrote pieces that reflected their emotional states, combining German musical traditions with new influences they encountered in America. Performances of this music today serve as reminders of the creative resilience of the human spirit even in difficult circumstances. The question of how to tell this story to subsequent generations has been challenging. For many years, the experiences of German prisoners of war in America were not widely discussed or taught. They didn't fit neatly into standard narratives of the war. Germans who had fought for Nazi Germany were supposed to be villains. The idea that they could be educated and transformed complicated the moral clarity of the war story. But more recently, historians and educators have recognized the value of this complicated history for understanding both the war and its aftermath. Documentary films and television programs have explored the prisoner of war experience, bringing these stories to broader audiences. Interviews with aging former prisoners, now in their 90s if still alive, capture first-hand accounts before that generation passes entirely. These documentaries reveal the lingering emotions, the unresolved questions, and the diverse ways men made sense of experiences that defied simple categorization. The physical sites of former prisoner of war camps have varied fates. Some were demolished and returned to civilian use. Others served different purposes after the war. A few have been preserved or marked with plaques commemorating what happened there. These sites are pilgrimage destinations for descendants of former prisoners trying to connect with family history and understand what their fathers or grandfathers experienced. Reunions of former prisoners have occurred over the years, bringing together men who shared camp experiences decades earlier. These gatherings are bittersweet, mixing nostalgia with more somber reflections on the war and its consequences. Former prisoners share stories, compare experiences, and sometimes grapple collectively with questions they've carried individually for years. Some reunions have included American guards or administrators, creating opportunities for people on both sides of the wire to reconnect and reflect on what they shared. The archival record continues to yield new insights as historians dig deeper into the documentation of the prisoner of war program. Letters between administrators reveal debates about methods and goals. Prisoner files show individual trajectories of change or resistance. Intelligence reports assess the program's effectiveness with varying degrees of optimism or skepticism. This documentary evidence allows us to reconstruct not just what happened but what people at the time thought was happening and why. Regional variations in the prisoner of war experience were substantial. A prisoner held in Louisiana had a very different experience from one in Montana or Wisconsin. Climate, local attitudes, the specific commanders in charge, available resources, and the nature of work assignments all varied. Some camps had robust educational programs with extensive libraries and frequent classes. Others had minimal educational resources and focused primarily on work details. Understanding these variations helps explain why some prisoners were more affected by their captivity than others. The role of chance in individual prisoner experiences cannot be overlooked. A man captured early in the war had years in American camps and more opportunity for transformation than someone captured in the final weeks. A prisoner who happened to speak English had advantages those who didn't could not access. Someone assigned to work on a farm where the family was kind had different experiences than a prisoner who encountered hostility. These accidents of circumstance often determined how much a prisoner's beliefs and attitudes changed. Language acquisition was a significant part of many prisoners' experiences. Learning English opened doors to more direct engagement with American culture and ideas. Prisoners who became fluent could read American newspapers and books directly rather than through translation. They could have substantive conversations with guards and civilians. They could access more advanced educational opportunities. For prisoners who later stayed in America, the English they learned in camp was foundational to their successful integration. The economic context of post-war Germany made the skills and knowledge gained by prisoners particularly valuable. With so much destroyed, anyone with expertise or new ideas could make a contribution. Former prisoners who had learned American agricultural methods could improve German farming. Those who had studied American business practices could help rebuild commerce and industry. Even those whose education had been more political and philosophical could contribute to institutional rebuilding. The devastation created opportunities for change that might not have existed in more stable circumstances. The psychological concept of cognitive dissonance helps explain why some prisoners changed their beliefs. When reality contradicted what they had been taught, when Americans proved not to be the villains of Nazi propaganda, when German crimes were revealed, prisoners experienced psychological discomfort. Some resolved this discomfort by dismissing the contradicting evidence as lies or propaganda. But others resolved it by changing their beliefs to match reality. The educational program provided frameworks and support for this second path. The role of peer influence within camps was crucial. When prisoners saw comrades they respected beginning to question Nazi ideology or embrace democratic ideas, it became more acceptable for them to do the same. Conversely, in camps where hardcore Nazis maintained dominance, peer pressure worked in the opposite direction. The American policy of segregating prisoners based on their political attitudes was an attempt to create environments where positive peer influence could operate without the intimidation that Nazi prisoners exercised over others. Religious conversion experiences were part of some prisoners' transformations. Men who had been nominally religious or not religious at all sometimes found faith during their captivity. The trauma of war, the moral questions raised by Nazi crimes, and the availability of chaplains and religious services created conditions for spiritual seeking. For some prisoners, religious conversion and political transformation were intertwined, both representing a fundamental reorientation of their lives. The experience of returning to a destroyed Germany after years in relatively comfortable American camps created its own form of trauma. Prisoners who had adapted to American abundance suddenly faced scarcity and deprivation again. Those who had come to appreciate democratic governance found themselves in an occupied country with limited sovereignty. The contrast between their captivity and their freedom was sometimes inverted, with captivity seeming in some ways easier than the chaos of immediate post-war Germany. Family reunification after the war was often difficult. Wives had been widowed or had assumed their husbands were dead and moved on. Children had grown up without fathers and didn't know the men who returned. The returned prisoner might have changed substantially during his captivity, holding new beliefs and values that family members didn't share or understand. Rebuilding these family relationships required patience and often professional help, though such help was scarce in devastated post-war Germany. The economic miracle of West Germany in the 1950s provided vindication for those who had embraced democratic capitalism during their captivity. As Germany recovered and prospered under democratic governance and market economics, it became easier to believe that the transformation had been worthwhile. Former prisoners could point to West Germany's success as evidence that the American model worked. The contrast with East Germany under communist rule was particularly stark. Some former prisoners became businessmen who traded between Germany and America, using their knowledge of both cultures and their language skills. They imported American products to Germany and exported German goods to America. They facilitated business partnerships and joint ventures. Their personal networks, including sometimes connections made during their captivity, enabled these commercial relationships. They became literal bridges between the two economies. Academic careers were another path for some former prisoners. Men who had discovered intellectual interests during their captivity pursued university education after returning to Germany. Some eventually became professors, teaching at German universities but maintaining connections with American institutions. They contributed to German scholarship while also facilitating academic exchange between the two countries. Their intellectual formation had been shaped by the books and ideas they encountered as prisoners. The journalism sector in post-war Germany included former prisoners who had worked on camp newspapers or discovered interests in writing during captivity. They brought to German journalism some of the practices and ethics of American journalism, including skepticism toward official pronouncements and commitment to investigating and reporting facts. These values were crucial for establishing a free press in democratic Germany after years of propaganda and censorship under the Nazis. Political parties in West Germany recruited and included former prisoners among their members and leaders. The Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democratic Party both had former prisoners who rose through their ranks. These men brought practical experience with democratic politics from observing or studying American systems. They understood party discipline, coalition building, compromise, and the other mechanics of democratic governance. Their contributions helped establish and stabilize West German democracy. The arts in post-war Germany reflected the experiences of returned prisoners in various ways. Novels, plays, and films dealt with themes of captivity, transformation, and return. Some were autobiographical, drawing directly on the author's experiences. Others used the prisoner of war experience as a metaphor for larger questions about German identity and responsibility. These cultural works helped German society process the traumatic recent past. Philosophical and theological debates in post-war Germany engaged questions that had been central to the prisoner of war re-education program. What is human nature? Can people change fundamentally? What are the foundations of morality? How should a society deal with collective guilt? German intellectuals grappled with these questions in the aftermath of Nazi crimes, and some of the participants in these debates were former prisoners whose thinking had been shaped by their captivity. The development of European integration and what would eventually become the European Union involved former prisoners in various capacities. Men who had learned to see beyond narrow nationalism, who understood the importance of international cooperation, and who had experienced American federalism brought these perspectives to debates about Europe's future. They advocated for structures that would prevent another war by binding European nations together economically and politically. Educational philosophy in West Germany was profoundly influenced by the need to prevent another generation from falling prey to totalitarian ideology. Former prisoners who had experienced democratic education in American camps contributed to debates about how German schools should operate. They pushed for curricula that taught critical thinking rather than obedience, that acknowledged uncomfortable historical truths, and that prepared students for citizenship in a democracy rather than subjects under authoritarian rule. The question of memory and how to remember the war became increasingly important as time passed. Former prisoners had to decide what to tell their children and grandchildren about their experiences. Some chose silence, finding the memories too painful or complicated to share. Others spoke openly, using their experiences as teaching moments. Still others shared selective memories, emphasizing certain aspects while downplaying or omitting others. Each approach shaped how the next generation understood the war and its aftermath. Monuments to prisoners of war exist in various forms. In some American towns that hosted camps, there are markers or small museums documenting what happened there. In Germany, memorials to prisoners of war sometimes include those held by the Allies, though the focus is often more on those held by the Soviets who suffered much harsher conditions. The former prisoners who became American citizens sometimes advocated for recognition of their experiences in American communities where they settled. The contrast between German prisoners held by America and American prisoners held by Japan was stark and raised difficult moral questions. American prisoners of the Japanese suffered terribly, with many dying from maltreatment, disease, and starvation. German prisoners in America were comparatively well treated. Some Americans felt this was unjust, that Germany should have been paid back in kind. Others argued that America's humane treatment of prisoners demonstrated moral superiority and ultimately served strategic interests better than revenge would have. Medical care for prisoners was another area where treatment exceeded minimum requirements. Camp hospitals treated not just acute injuries and illnesses but also provided dental care and addressed chronic conditions. Some prisoners received medical treatment in American camps that was better than what was available to German civilians during the war. This medical care was partly humanitarian but also pragmatic, as healthy prisoners could work more effectively and were less likely to cause problems. Sports competitions between prisoners and between camps became serious affairs with elaborate organization. Soccer leagues had standings, playoffs, and championships. Boxing matches and track meets were held. These competitions provided entertainment and exercise but also taught lessons about following rules, accepting defeat gracefully, and competing without violence. American authorities encouraged sports as both a control mechanism and an educational tool. The camp canteens where prisoners could purchase small luxuries with their earnings from work became important spaces of economic education. Prisoners learned about prices, scarcity, supply and demand, and consumer choice in microcosm. They could see how market mechanisms worked in a small-scale but real way. For prisoners who had grown up under Nazi economic controls and wartime rationing, this exposure to market principles was novel and often persuasive. Photography from the camps provides visual documentation of prisoner life. Official military photographs show organized activities, work details, and camp facilities. Less formal photographs, sometimes taken by guards or prisoners with cameras, show more candid moments. These images reveal both the quotidian aspects of camp life and the more significant moments of education and transformation. They show young men's faces, some defiant, others contemplative, still others simply bored or tired. The question of whether the re-education program constituted indoctrination or genuine education remains debated. Critics argue that prisoners were in a coercive situation where they had to appear to change their beliefs to gain privileges or favorable treatment. Defenders argue that exposure to books, ideas, and experiences that had been denied them under Nazi rule was liberating rather than coercive. The truth likely varied by individual, with some prisoners genuinely transformed and others simply performing transformation. The role of intelligence officers in assessing prisoner attitudes and selecting candidates for intensive re-education was significant. These officers had to make judgments about sincerity and potential based on limited information. They developed techniques for interviewing prisoners and evaluating their political reliability. Some of these techniques later found application in intelligence work during the Cold War. The prisoner of war camps became laboratories for understanding political psychology and belief change. Camp libraries were carefully curated to include books that would challenge Nazi ideology while also appealing to German cultural sensibilities. Classic German literature was prominently featured, showing that being German and being anti-Nazi were not contradictory. Works by German authors who had fled the Nazis or been banned were included. Philosophy, history, and political theory from democratic traditions were well represented. But also popular fiction, technical books, and other materials that might simply give prisoners pleasure and demonstrate American abundance. The transition from military administration of prisoner re-education to civilian occupation authorities after the war created some continuity and some change. Military personnel who had worked on prisoner education often continued in similar roles in occupied Germany. They brought their experience and relationships with former prisoners to the larger project of German reconstruction. But civilian agencies and organizations also became involved, bringing different perspectives and approaches. International law regarding prisoners of war was tested and refined through the American experience with German prisoners. The Geneva Conventions were generally observed, and this compliance demonstrated that international humanitarian law could work even in total war. After the war, the precedent set by American treatment of German prisoners influenced discussions about updating and strengthening international protections for prisoners of war. The Cold War created situations where former German soldiers, including former prisoners of war, were recruited by Western intelligence services. Their knowledge of German, their understanding of communist ideology, and sometimes their personal networks in East Germany made them valuable assets. The irony of former enemies becoming intelligence assets against a former ally was not lost on anyone, but Cold War logic made such arrangements seem necessary. Some former prisoners became interpreters and translators, using the language skills they had developed or improved during captivity. They worked for occupation authorities, for businesses, for cultural organizations, and for the emerging institutions of international cooperation in Europe. Their bilingualism was valuable in a period when German-American communication was crucial, but German speakers who were politically reliable were in short supply. The experience of former prisoners who stayed in America and those who returned to Germany diverged over time. Those in America generally prospered with the American economy and became integrated into American society, though often maintaining some German cultural identity. Those who returned to Germany participated in Reconstruction and benefited from the economic miracle, but also had to continue grappling with German historical responsibility and memory. Occasional visits or correspondence kept some connections alive between these two groups. Veterans organizations in both countries struggled with how to incorporate former prisoners of war. American veterans groups didn't always welcome men who had fought for Germany, even if they were now American citizens. German veterans organizations were complicated by the Nazi past and questions about which veterans deserved recognition. Former prisoners of war occupied an ambiguous position in both contexts, neither quite veteran nor quite civilian. The long-term health effects of captivity were generally minimal for German prisoners held in America, in contrast to many other prisoner of war populations. The adequate nutrition, medical care, and generally humane conditions meant that most prisoners emerged from captivity in reasonable physical condition. Some carried psychological scars, but even these were often less severe than what combat veterans typically experienced. This relative health was itself evidence of how well prisoners had been treated. Memoirs written by former prisoners many years after the war provide valuable sources but must be read carefully. Memory is fallible and shaped by subsequent experiences and changing social contexts. Former prisoners writing decades later might emphasize aspects of their experience that seemed more significant in retrospect or downplay elements that had become embarrassing or problematic. But even with these limitations, memoirs provide irreplaceable insights into subjective experiences and personal meanings. The role of chance encounters in individual prisoner transformations is striking in many accounts. A prisoner might have a single conversation with an American guard or civilian that planted a seed of doubt about Nazi ideology. Another might read one particular book that opened new ways of thinking. A third might witness one act of kindness or fairness that challenged his stereotypes. These small moments, insignificant at the time, sometimes had outsized impacts when the prisoner reflected on them later. The process of becoming an American citizen for former prisoners involved both legal requirements and personal transformation. Legally, they had to meet immigration criteria, demonstrate English proficiency, pass civics tests, and take loyalty oaths. Personally, they had to embrace American identity while integrating rather than abandoning their German heritage. They had to find ways to be both German and American, to honor their origins while committing to their new country. Children of former prisoners who became American sometimes struggled with their complex heritage. They were Americans by birth but had fathers who had fought against America. They often grew up speaking German at home but English everywhere else. They might visit relatives in Germany and feel connections to that country while being fully American in outlook and identity. These hyphenated identities, German-American in a very literal sense, enriched American diversity while also sometimes creating personal confusion. The question of forgiveness is central to the prisoner of war story. Should Americans forgive German soldiers who fought for Nazi Germany? Should Germans forgive Americans for bombing German cities? Should former prisoners forgive themselves for their participation in an evil cause? These questions have no simple answers but were and are navigated by individuals making personal choices. The prisoner of war education program implicitly suggested that forgiveness was possible if transformation was genuine. The economic cost of running the prisoner of war camps and education programs was substantial but was generally considered worthwhile. Prisoner labor helped offset some costs, as did the strategic value of having prisoners available rather than requiring more American troops to guard them overseas. But beyond these practical considerations, the investment in education was seen as contributing to post-war stability, which had immense value given the catastrophic costs of 2 world wars. Different academic disciplines have studied the prisoner of war experience from various angles. Historians have documented what happened and why. Political scientists have analyzed the effectiveness of re-education programs. Psychologists have examined belief change and attitude formation. Sociologists have studied reintegration and identity formation. Literature scholars have analyzed memoirs and fiction about the prisoner experience. Each discipline brings different tools and questions to understanding these events. The aging of the prisoner of war generation and their gradual passing has created urgency around documenting their experiences. Oral history projects have raced against time to interview survivors before they die. Archives have worked to collect documents, photographs, and artifacts before they are lost. The need to preserve this history for future generations has become more pressing as the number of living witnesses dwindles toward zero. Museums dealing with World War II have had to decide how to incorporate the prisoner of war story into their narratives. It complicates the simple story of good versus evil that sometimes characterizes popular understanding of the war. Showing that some enemy soldiers were transformed through education raises questions about responsibility, redemption, and the nature of evil. But it also enriches our understanding of the war's complexity and aftermath. Educational curricula in both Germany and America have increasingly included material about prisoners of war and re-education. Students learn about the camps, the education programs, and the post-war outcomes. This history provides opportunities to discuss larger themes about human nature, political ideology, education, justice, and reconciliation. It shows students that history is more complicated than simple narratives of good and evil allow. The comparison between German and Japanese prisoners of war held by America is instructive. Japanese prisoners were much fewer in number because Japanese military culture emphasized death over surrender. Those Japanese prisoners who were taken often faced similar re-education efforts but with less apparent success. Cultural differences, the different nature of Japanese and German ideologies, and the different post-war contexts all contributed to different outcomes. The relationship between the prisoner of war experience and the broader question of totalitarianism's appeal is important. Why do people embrace totalitarian ideologies? Can they be argued or educated out of these beliefs? The prisoner of war program suggested that at least some people could change their political beliefs when exposed to alternatives and when the failures and crimes of totalitarianism were revealed. But it also showed that some believers remained committed despite overwhelming evidence against their ideology. The role of material prosperity in the transformation of prisoners should not be underestimated. Many prisoners were struck by American abundance, the well-fed population, the consumer goods, the mechanized agriculture, the general sense of plenty. This material success seemed to validate democratic capitalism in ways that abstract arguments could not. Prisoners returned to destroyed Germany carrying memories of American prosperity that made democratic reconstruction seem attractive. The question of what made some prisoners receptive to re-education while others remained resistant occupies a complex intersection of psychology, biography, and chance. Educational level, age, personal experiences during the war, family background, religious faith, and personality all played roles. But even accounting for these factors, there remained an irreducible element of individual choice. Some prisoners decided to open themselves to new ideas while others chose to close themselves off. As we look back on this history from our current vantage point, several lessons emerge. Humane treatment of prisoners serves both moral and strategic purposes. Education can change minds but is not universally effective. Transformation is possible but not inevitable. Individual encounters and relationships matter more than grand programs sometimes do. The capacity for change exists in most people but must be activated by circumstances and choices. And perhaps most importantly, former enemies can become fellow citizens if given opportunity, education, and time. The story of German prisoners of war in America, their education, their transformation, and some eventually becoming American citizens, is ultimately a story about human possibility. It shows that even after terrible conflicts, reconciliation and integration can occur. It demonstrates that political beliefs, even deeply held ones, can change when challenged by reality and alternative ideas. It reveals that national identity is not fixed but can be adopted and adapted. And it reminds us that how we treat our enemies says as much about us as it does about them, shaping not just their futures but our own.